Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that, Stephanie. Now you'll have to sort of indulge me here. I'm afraid you'll have to bear with me because I haven't formally prepared a paper that has a start, a middle, and an end. It's more of a kind of a potpourri. There are bits all put together. Some of them smell quite nice, others don't. Hopefully, we'll make some sort of coherence. But the other thing is, over today and yesterday, I've been changing and adding and adapting a lot of ideas based upon the extraordinary conversations that have been taking place, both over coffee and lunch and in the panels. So I've been adding and moving and changing. So I'll be bringing in all sorts of different things that we've been dealing with over the last over this day and yesterday. I'm going to be talking about Borges. Now, just quickly, just so that everyone knows who we're talking about, Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, born in 1899 in Argentina. Argentine, born in Geneva and died in Geneva. He's most well known for his short stories, his tales, his short tales of labyrinthine complexity. But he was also a poet, he was also an essayist, and a very prodigious poet and essayist. And he wrote a lot of reviews as well. And there's a lot of genre blending within Borges's work. So what an essay might read as a short story, and a short story might read as an essay. And I'll elaborate on that sort of element a little bit later. I've been talking quite a lot about Borges recently. I've just been in Spain, and I was teaching for a week in the University of Córdoba, and I delivered a couple of lectures there about Borges. One of the things that has been my experience, both of reading and of talking about Borges with other people, is the fact that there's a great unsettling quality to Borges. He's a great unsettler. He appears to be highly adept at blurring boundaries, at breaking down boundaries, at unsettling people, but unsettling people not in a damaging way, in a way which I consider to be highly constructive. I've been leading a course on Borges here, and the incredibly active feedback that I've had with the group has been for me highly illuminating, of people explaining quite how they've been moved by the reading and the conversations that we've been having. And it culminated in this extraordinary little line from one of the group, a girl. It was just before Christmas, and she says, "I just want to go home now." And I said, "Really?" She goes, "And I want to get a microwave lasagna, and I want to put it in the microwave and know that it'll be cooked, because nothing seems to be right anymore. Everything seems to be different and wrong." And I said, "Okay, but is that, are you happy about that?" She goes, "Not really." But then again, she wrote really good feedback in the form. But there was a sense as we had this long group conversation about how one's certainties are broken down. And I kind of elaborated on this last month in this tremendous conference that took place here on psychedelic consciousness, that was run by Cameron, whom you may have met, and his wife Anna, and various others. And I was talking about Borges from a psychedelic perspective, from the perspective of the erasure of boundaries, the breaking down of established principles, the movement of ideas from one area to another, that fluidity and that unsettling quality which one is familiar within the psychedelic world. And it was quite an interesting thing, because bizarrely enough, although Borges is very much treated within the established academy, and there's been more books written about Borges than there have been books written about Shakespeare almost, nevertheless there's also that side to Borges which is psychedelic, and indeed there are editions of his works that were published in the 60s with all sorts of wild covers. I don't know if any of you are familiar with them. There are also, I've heard people talking about Borges from that kind of, wasn't he one of those wild 60s writers? The fact that he was actually quite critical of hippies is a funny sort of, change of thought. But in any respect, there is a kind of a tradition of looking at Borges within that sort of psychedelic community, that psychedelic side, which I think is quite interesting. So what am I going to be talking about today? Well, if I can work my way through it. I'm quite interested in the fact that Borges deals with paradox. Because paradox is mystery. And the big paradox at the root of everything that I find within Borges, in his interviews as well, which I didn't mention earlier, is this essential paradox. The essential paradox, which is that no sabemos qué cosa es el universo. We don't know what the universe is. And yet, we ceaselessly strive to understand it. And I was thinking earlier about Stephanie's paper about the ceaselessly striving for knowledge. Now, again, with the idea of the philosopher's stone, you're seeking knowledge knowing that the ultimate knowledge is not necessarily forthcoming. And indeed, part of the knowledge that you're gaining is the knowledge itself, that knowledge is not to be gained, if that paradox makes sense. In a way, the great message, the great philosopher's stone message is that there is no message, which itself is a message. So there you are, we're dealing with paradox. But I'll just read a couple of quotes here, because I think it's quite interesting to see how he articulates this. There are numerous things. Like I said, I've got 200 pages of notes, so I could reach for any quote if I wanted. If life's meaning were explained to us, he says, we probably wouldn't understand it. To think that a man can find it is absurd. We can live without understanding what the world is or who we are. The important things are the ethical instinct and the intellectual instinct, are they not? The intellectual instinct is the one that makes us search while knowing that we are never going to find the answer. In the past, I tried to believe in a personal God, but I do not think I try anymore. I remember in that respect, I'm an admirable expression of George Bernard Shaw, that God is in the making. So this is the idea that he elaborates on time and again, which is this extraordinary paradox that we are all confronted with, of striving to find answers to the riddle of the universe, knowing that those answers are not forthcoming, but at the same time not saying, well, if there are no answers to be gained, then why don't we just sit back and watch football and not bother, gathering in groups like this? Well, of course we do bother, and that's the point. And yet, at the same time, there's this amazing sense of skepticism or cynicism that one finds in Borges. Skepticism, which I found a wonderful parallel in Alan Watts, which is about doubt. He says doubt is a step back in order to make a biggest leap forward, which I thought was wonderful. I found that in this great book that was published in the 40s, Alan Watts, called Behold the Spirit, which is a sort of biblical sounding text, but it's a good book. And he talks about doubt is a step backwards in order to make a leap further forwards. And I find that very true within Borges, because the doubt, this skepticism, is itself a step away from blind credulity of any system, and a step towards what might be considered to be more valuable, the truth value within those systems, because in a way, the skepticism, this doubt, is this step away from any of these systems, be they philosophical, theological, political, social, or mystical, and that's my little hook here. And at the same time, within Borges, there is this tremendous epistemological value that he places upon the dream world, upon nightmares, in particular nightmares, visions, and the imagination. I use the imagination with a capital I, as in William Blake. So here we've got this tremendous value that he places upon the experiences of that which we can, to use Angela's expression, imaginal. The great value attached to such experiences. Value that's the same as something which is, let's say, material, an experience, and I'll explain it a little bit later. An experience within a dream is as real and is as important in terms of the knowledge gained, the experience. It's as important as a for example, a meeting with a friend or a travel somewhere, a journey somewhere. There's no essential difference. And this is something that's very familiar with readers of Borges, this division between fact and fiction, between truth and falsehood, between history and myth. It's all mixed around, essentially, that it's all part of an interior process. So from that, with this relationship between skepticism and which itself means an absence of firm belief, moving that alongside his experiences of the imaginal and his extraordinarily prodigious readings of everything. Everything from ancient Buddhist texts to Stevenson and Kipling and Chesterton to works of Christian mystics to Old and New Testament to the Gnostic texts when they were discovered. His reading is just astonishing. The only person I found who read as much as him, probably D, is Jung. And indeed there's a whole side to Borges which is closely parallel with that of Jung, and nobody's yet written about that, and I'm attempting to do so. And it's based upon a synchronicity that Borges identifies within his own life. I might explain that later if I have time. So, from this, I'm going to be developing. I've been a fool as well. I printed off 30 copies of his little essay on angels, and I left it in my office. I thought about dashing off, but I didn't want to miss Stephanie's paper. So I'll go off afterwards, and I'll leave it in the room through there. So later on, if anyone's interested, it's just a one-page, two sides. It's a small essay from 1926 called On Angels. And I'll go and get it from my office later and leave it in the room through there. But in particular, I'm going to be concentrating on this book, which is a book that very few people know about. I'll circulate it. It's a wonderful book. I recommend you all buy it. Even if you haven't got any money, steal it. Don't steal that. It's a tremendous book. It's called The Book of Imaginary Beings. And I was struck by something that Ronald spoke about yesterday in his keynote speaker about the taxonomy. There's no taxonomy of angelic beings or even imaginary beings. There isn't a taxonomy because obviously they are not part of that the flora and fauna of the natural world to the same degree, for example, that insects and butterflies, etc. are. But nevertheless, Borges does to a certain degree create not a taxonomy, but certainly a compilation of texts and traditions that are dealing with all sorts of mythical beasts, monsters, fairies, pixies, brownies, etc., 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 mermaids, unicorns. It's a wonderful little book there. Now, what I'm trying to do is try and work through his very brief little mentions, because what he does so often is a compiler. He's a great compiler, Borges. He brings together texts from all over the place. And he was something I didn't mention at the beginning. In addition to all the other writing he did, he compiled loads of books of other people's texts. He just brought them together. He wasn't plagiarizing them, he was recognizing where they the sources. He was a great compiler along with his friend Bioy Casares. And so in a way, what he's doing is he's working with these texts without necessarily giving his take on them. But you can find his take on them within his interviews, within small footnotes here, within a reference here. And I've been bringing these together. I've been reading Borges since I was 14, so I've had plenty of time to deal with this, although I haven't been thinking on these terms all that time. But I've been trying to piece together exactly what is his effective relationship with imaginal beings, with these daimonic forms. How does he conceptualize of some ontological space in which they exist? How far can we look at it from a Jungian perspective of archetypes, archetypal beings, archetypal forms within the unconscious that can manifest themselves in all sorts of different outward appearance, depending on the culture, depending on the time, depending on the person. Does he ascribe any actual sort of extrinsic to human relationship, extrinsic to human ontological space for such beings? Or if he's bringing them purely to the imaginal, is that a reduction? Does it become simply a flight of fancy? And these are the questions which I find really interesting. And indeed, these are the questions that we've been asking throughout this conference in many respects. It's about saying not just our relationship with that aspect of our psyches which are flighty and shadowy and difficult to pin down. But also asking, what is their relationship with us? Do they depend on us for their existence? And what is the nature of that existence? I find these very fascinating questions. So, going back to this early thing of mysticism, because I think this is a good doorway into an approach to this matter. One of the most common symbols, one of the most frequently used symbols in Borges' world is the labyrinth, which probably anyone who's familiar with Borges will immediately know that. Indeed, there was a 1960s edition of his 1940s tales in English, which were called Fictiones and Fictions and The Garden of Forking Paths, and they were compiled by Penguin together as labyrinths. So it's well understood that there's a labyrinthine motif or symbol throughout his work. Now he doesn't, I'll keep this for another day, he does ascribe a fairly sort of Platonic idea to symbols, that the symbols are somehow permanent and exist somehow in a different order of time, and symbols only change their outward appearance, but again the symbols are there permanent throughout human experience. But nevertheless, one of the things that he realizes is that existence itself is labyrinthine, and there's a wonderful link here with Marguerite's paper earlier of the whole Minoan concept of the Minotaur and the labyrinth. And of course, there is a centre to the labyrinth, but you don't know where that centre is, and you don't know who lurks there, and you don't know whether the centre of the labyrinth will actually be a Gnostic revelation or not, or whether it will be death and annihilation. So this constant use of the labyrinth is itself a very evocative symbol for explaining the confusion that we find ourselves with in life. However, it's very important, this is, again, I'm making a link to Patrick Curry's paper from yesterday, talking about enchantment. I thought that was a wonderful paper. I thought it was an enchanting paper. I suddenly realised, it only occurred to me yesterday that, of course, enchantment is the best word to use for Borges' use of the word puzzled, baffled, mystified, confused, because this is not a sense of existential dread that there is no meaning to life and therefore we are doomed to ignorance. No, this is a wonderful, positive sense of we don't know. And yet we, as I mentioned earlier, and yet we want to know. And this is what drives us. This is a kind of a will. He almost develops a sort of a Schopenhauerian notion of will, but it's the will to know. It's the will to know, not the will to power in the Nietzschean sense, and it's not the will to sex, as in the Freudian sense. It's the will to know. It's that will to understand that keeps propelling us forward. At least some of us. Maybe not everyone. And a couple of quotes, pretty much in every interview. In fact, I would go so far as to say in every interview. And I've read a whole load of interviews. He became very familiar. I think he became a bit of a celebrity. I think he kind of enjoyed it, giving interviews. He always says the same thing about being mystified. And I've got thousands of quotes, just a couple. There is nothing in the world that is not mysterious, he says. The world is so mysterious and so rich, he says in another. I think of the world as a riddle. And the one beautiful thing about it is that it cannot be solved. But of course, I think the world needs a riddle. I feel amazement all the time. And two of those quotes come from a beautiful book. Again, I'd recommend you start with this. It's called Borges at 80. He'd been blind for years by this stage. And it's a series of interviews that he gave at Princeton University. It's wonderful. He's very sort of wistful and wise. At the same time, still quite cutting and very iconoclastic. I recommend that book. You can buy it on Amazon. Borges at 80. So, we have this labyrinthine structure in which we live. And then going back to this idea of skepticism, it's been widely held that Borges... I didn't start at 3, did I?
About 2 minutes past.
Yes, sorry. I'll be very brief and I'll try and get hard and fast, okay? The use of philosophy, the use of theology, the use of different systems for aesthetic purposes. That's to say, he delves deeply, deeply, deeply in all forms of systems of belief, in all forms of systems of thought. And to an alarming degree, he has an intimate knowledge of Buddhism, for example, and Buddhist texts, an intimate knowledge of Sufi mystic texts, an intimate knowledge of biblical texts and biblical exegesis, an intimate knowledge of Swedenborg and Blake and others. It's an extraordinary knowledge that he has, and yet at the same time he has that distance. He's saying, you know, although this knowledge I have, I'm not a Christian, I'm not Buddhist, I'm not Hindu, I'm not Sufi. It's a rare ability that he has to be so deeply ingrained in a field of a system of thought, and yet at the same time professing this distance from it. So, the question being, this is widely held as a position, indeed he held it himself, he mentions this himself in his interviews, that he belongs to none of these systems of thought, despite his extreme knowledge of these. And he's asked this beautiful question that I have to say, if I knew him, I'd have asked him this question, where in a book called Conversations with Borges, the interviewer Richard Bergin asked him, is mysticism, and then this is the quote, a break out of the maze? So that labyrinth I was talking about earlier, that labyrinth of unknowing, is mysticism a break out of the maze? And do you know what Borges' wonderful answer is? I don't know, he says. He's being elusive there, and a bit of a trickster. But it's an extraordinary question, and I find that a very pertinent question. Does he treat with the same degree of skepticism mystics, as he does, for example, philosophers and theologians? On the one hand, yes, because he appears to make no real distinction between, for example, visions expressed through fiction, through H.G. Wells, for example, and visions expressed, for example, through what might be considered genuine mystical experience, such as Swedenborg or Blake. Indeed, in this book you have Swedenborg's angels alongside H.G. Wells's Morlocks. So there's an interesting, sort of that itself is an indication of we're dealing with creatures of the imaginal. And indeed, what might be a genuine experience is no more or less a genuine experience than what might be considered a fictional experience. For example, he has the Reverend Kirk's fairies from the Commonwealth of the 17th century. He has, as I said, Swedenborg's angels and demons. And yet it's not so simple. Okay? First of all, he does express the fact that any child in the zoo is already dealing with wondrous beings, with imaginal beings, especially if it's the first time the child has seen an elephant or a hippopotamus or a rhino. Secondly, monsters, and this is an important thing, appear to, and this is what I was saying earlier about Jung, they appear to occupy this archetypal space in the collective unconscious. And I'll read a couple of quotes here. On page 14, sorry, I don't need to do the page number. Let me just get the actual... we are as ignorant of the meaning of the dragon, he says, as we are of the meaning of the universe. But there is something in the dragon's image that appeals to the human imagination, and so we find the dragon in quite distinct places and times. It is, so to speak, a necessary monster, not an ephemeral or accidental one, such as the three-headed chimera or the catoblepas. It's a Peruvian thing. Okay, so they occupy, as he says, they occupy it appeals to the human imagination, okay, and hence its position again and again. And then he says, he mentions that the centaur again is an archetype, that the centaur is a being which appears to be represented globally, and indeed he then mentions this wonderful tale of the conquistadors who were seen by the indigenous Americans as being a centaur-like being until one of the horsemen fell off. And thirdly, he goes on talking about the dragon later on when he has this whole section on dragons. People believe that, and thirdly, he seems to, despite his prominent position in modernism and postmodernism, and by dint of that I mean modernity in the modern world, especially his relationship with structuralist thought and deconstruction and literary theory and other things. You know, he's a key feature of the 20th century project. Still, we can see that one of the abiding elements of Borges is a hankering back to a pre-modern time, to pre-modernity. In fact, he was once asked about which contemporary writers he most likes to read, and he says Shakespeare. which is an indication of his moving to a previous world. And here he says, and I've got a couple of things here, some beautiful things. The second one, actually, Jeffrey, I sent to you a few months ago. People believed in the reality of the dragon, he said. That might not be true. In the middle of the 16th century, the dragon is recorded in Conrad Gestier's Historia Animalium, a work of scientific nature. Time has notably worn away the dragon's prestige. We believe in the lion as reality and symbol. We believe in the minotaur as symbol, but no longer reality. The dragon is perhaps the best known, but also the least fortunate of the fantastic animals. It seems childish to us and usually spoils the stories in which it appears. It is worth remembering, however, that we are dealing with a modern prejudice, due perhaps to a surfeit of dragons and fairy tales. But in any respect, a modern prejudice which means, I've only got 28 pages to cover, which means that we will necessarily not see it as reality and symbol, but only symbol, and in many respects not even symbol. And then again he talked about Plato. This is the quote that I sent you, Jeffrey, a while ago. With Plato, he says, you feel that he would reason in an abstract way and would also use myth. He would do these two things at the same time, but now we seem to have lost that gift. I mean, you have gone from myth to abstract thinking, but Plato could do both at the same time. I suppose at that time it could be done, but nowadays those things seem to be in watertight compartments. Either we are thinking or we are dreaming, but Plato and Socrates could do both. So much more to say. Let me just read. As I said, I forgot to bring that passage on angels, but I'll just read the conclusion because I think it's absolutely beautiful. I find it quite moving, actually. He runs through the whole history of angels. He gives effectively, bizarrely enough, Ronald did yesterday, talking about the sort of the history of fairies. He does a whole history of angels, talking about the theological texts they appear in, the ancient texts they appear in, and how they've metamorphosized over the years. It's a wonderful little text. And he concludes here, and I think it's a beautifully poetic text. Here we arrive at the near miracle that is the true motive for this writing, what we might call the survival of the angel. The human imagination has pictured a horde of monsters, tritons, hippogriffs, chimeras, sea serpents, unicorns, devils, dragons, werewolves, cyclops, fauns, basilisks, demigods, leviathans, and a legion of others, all of which appear in his book. Sounds like a bit of a plug for his book. And all have disappeared, except angels. I wouldn't agree with him now. I don't think they all have disappeared. One of the things we've been discussing today and yesterday. Today, what line of poetry would dare allude to the phoenix or make itself the promenade of a centaur? None. But no poetry, however modern, is unhappy to be a nest of angels and to shine brightly with them. I always imagine them at nightfall, in the dusk of a slum or in a vacant lot, in that long, quiet moment when things are gradually left alone, with their backs to the sunset, and that's an allusion to Swedenborg, with their backs to the sunset, and when colours are like memories or premonitions of other colours. We must not be too prodigal with our angels. They are the last divinities we harbour, and they might fly away. I'll end there. I'll let Borges end there.
Yeah.
Much more to say.